Hi, I'm Bob Herbert. Welcome to OpEd.tv. One of the most significant and traumatic developments in New York City's history was the fiscal crisis that erupted with shocking force in the mid-1970s. The city asked the President of the United States, Gerald Ford, for help. And when Ford declined, the Daily News published the most famous headline in its history. It said simply, "Ford to city, drop dead." There were many people who helped shepherd New York through those terrible days. None was more important than the financier Felix Rohatyn. We now have a wonderful new documentary about that era and Mr. Rohatyn and many other key participants in the events that almost brought this great city to its knees. It's called Drop Dead City, New York on the Brink in 1975. It's co-directed by Peter Yost and Michael Rohatyn, Felix's son, who was 12 years old when the crisis hit. They are my guests. Gentlemen, welcome. And congratulations. It's a really amazing film that you've already won a big award. So, Peter, what's that about?
We'll take anything we can get. Yes, so there is an annual award given by the Library of Congress, the Levine Foundation, along with Ken Burns, that selects a single documentary from across the country about American history that they think is exceptional or of some worth anyway, and they give at least by our standards, a significant cash prize towards its completion and a fair bit of attention through the Library of Congress to complete the film and to help distribute it. So we're pretty honored to have this award, and we think it's a real ratification about the importance of this subject, not just domestically in New York, but to the whole country.
Right. So the film carries me back to my earliest days at the Daily News. I started in March 1976. And it was a pretty crazy and also very harrowing time in the city. So, Michael, maybe you can start by describing this crisis that hit right there in the middle of 1975. What happened and just how dire was it?
Well, it was, as we made the film, we found that one of the difficulties was in the fact that the city was already in decline. So when this crisis hit, which was a financial crisis, which was the discovery that New York City's debt was unmanageable and actually indescribable. Nobody quite knew how much New York City owed. The accounting was very, very shabby. And the public markets, financial markets shut down. The city could not borrow any money, and the city was in the habit of borrowing money short-term just to pay the payroll. So this very quickly created an impossible situation for the city and for the banks that owned all of this debt.
In 1975, the city of New York was fundamentally bankrupt.
What we have had here is political ineptitude.
Why should there be faith in government? Government has let the people down.
They didn't have an accounting system.
Everybody had stuff in drawers. There were no fucking books.
It's hard to say when things began to get really bad for the city because the city had already been in years of decline from white flight, from...
With the white flight took an important part of the tax base with it.
Yeah. And yes, and all of the corporate headquarters moving out, all of that. And the recession, the malaise of Watergate. There were a number of things that already New York City had kind of been working through. And so it's when this happened in 1975, it sort of was just sort of the final blow.
As you're pointing out, this had been going on for a while. The city was borrowing money to pay everyday expenses. It seems that there must have been a lot of people who understood that the budget itself was a fantasy, like a sinkhole of fantasies. You had bankers, you had accountants, you had lawyers, public officials. I mean, they weren't blind. Were they just in denial? Was it a collective, unconscious cover-up? Why didn't anybody say anything?
Well, I think it was a profitable business. So I don't
would
think that
answer
ever
the
hurts.
question.
It never hurts. And, you know, it's amazing to what degree these markets rely on faith and trust. And as long as there was this idea that Albany would fund whatever New York needed, then New York was a safe bet. And New York City had developed a habit of going to Albany to fund its very ambitious social programs.
Right.
And we had a very ambitious Republican governor who was himself very keen and interested in social programs.
Nelson Rockefeller.
Nelson Rockefeller,
who wasn't still the governor in 75, but he had been governor
Right.
for several years before that.
Right.
So people just didn't believe that the state would
Exactly.
let the city go over the cliff.
I also think, just to echo what you're saying, I mean, I think there were vested interests. The banks benefited.
Banks were making tons of money.
by loaning, and other people and politicians remained in power by spending, and citizens benefited by having things bought and spent. And there was a liberal ethos that we kind of explore. It's maybe a thread that runs through the film, of kind of this tension where New York had long been something of a city on a hill and represented a place for people to come and make themselves, and that the city would give you a baseline through publicly funded education, higher education at CUNY and elsewhere, and that there was a commitment in a way. And that sort of, when the tide came out, for the reasons that Michael mentioned, there was a question of whether the city could continue to provide these services. And this really played out in the streets, among other things.
The city really did provide a lot of services that were admirable. I mean, there were health services. You mentioned free college education at CUNY, for example. And even with the manufacturing base leaving, eroding, you still had the municipal jobs, you still had government jobs that could sustain a middle-class standard of living, and they thought, families thought security, and for a long time that was the case. So
Right.
it wasn't like it was all this nefarious kind of thing going on.
No.
But
yeah.
it didn't, but it blew up.
It blew up. It blew up badly.
Also, as the film suggests, in a very visible way, on the streets, literally.
Right.
Strikes, garbage strikes, police shutting down the bridges, the drawbridges being left up.
Right.
All kinds of things going on that made it, from a filmmaking and a storytelling standpoint, dramatic, and we had a dramatic frame that we could use to engage these potentially wonky kind of intellectual political issues.
The top of the news this morning, the Big Apple turning a bit sour.
Money! Yeah, money!
When people say they gotta tighten your belt, that's us around our necks.
I love picking up garbage. That's my money. What do you think I throw things in the street for? Because I have a job tomorrow.
What we're hopefully succeeding in doing with these kind of vignettes of things that are even, dare I say, entertaining, but they're certainly colorful and
Right.
playing out visually. But at the heart of them are these questions of what does a government owe its people? Because this was questions of affordability. Could a middle class live here? Is this just a place for the rich? What happens to those who are less fortunate? Again, what does a government owe? What can we afford? What are the priorities?
And of course, in this film, you have all these colorful characters as well from back in the 1970s, who were more or less the talking heads who were guiding us through it. So we had the reality of what was happening on the ground, but we also had these interesting figures
Right.
who were very powerful folks in those days.
We are about to take an action because we have been given no other choice.
You have anything encouraging to take home to the mayor? Anything at all? No.
And speaking of powerful, can one of you just explain to me, or explain for our viewers, just how powerful the municipal labor unions were in those days in New York?
Well, immense. I mean, it was sort of an open secret that they could kind of dictate to the mayor, if the mayor was weak, what contracts that they wanted. So I think that it was a great era for labor. These were actually charismatic men. It meant that when the city began laying off at a scale that was just unbelievable, 40, 50,000 people at an incredible rate, that these guys had a lot of power to push back. And they had also a lot of vested interest.
Right.
So there was a feeling a little bit maybe of entitlement, like this is our town. But you know, when you're in the municipal unions, it is your town. Mm-hmm. You are the sanitation man. You are picking up the garbage. You are running the subways. You are firefighters. You're risking your life. Exactly. Yep. The teachers. This is your community. And what we were struck by is when you're being paid a very good wage, not a great wage, but a solid wage, you can afford to live in the city. So it hit everybody much more as a local story, a civic story, and that wound up including kind of everybody. I think that was a period of time where the banks were very local, the press was very, very committed to the city, not simply to just reporting a story, but this was their town. And we found that, you know, all of that, these typically, and you know, people who were antagonists normally, were drawn together by this shared existential kind of commitment.
So zooming ahead, the city, almost within hours of bankruptcy at one point, it can't figure a way out of this, so it actually goes to the federal government to seek some help. Gerald Ford is president, and what happened?
There was a Secretary of the Treasury by the name of William Simon. He had been a bond king at Salomon Brothers, a very, very wealthy man from Wall Street who had been elevated to the Secretary of the Treasury. And the first stop was to the Secretary of the Treasury looking for some financial support for New York City. And again, this is for, we need cash. We don't have next week's payroll. And the banks won't lend us money unless we begin to have, the banks are reassured that Washington is going to back up the commitment.
And that's where the money to meet the payroll is going to come from. It has to be advanced by the bank, which of course, then it has to be paid back by an entity that's essentially bankrupt.
Exactly, exactly. For the Treasury and then for Ford, this was the beginning of an ideological turn in America, away from a much more liberal republicanism. Donald Rumsfeld and Dick Cheney were the young, you know, superstars of the Ford White House.
It was so funny to see them in the film.
I know.
These two guys of all people, Cheney and Rumsfeld, even then.
And they had a Midwestern antipathy towards New York as well, which is kind of playing out both folks outside of New York kind of, to some degree, it's a recurring theme at times, had it in for the city. And it was sort of like, go hang. So
Right.
yes, they went to Washington.
And it was kind of the beginning of this demonizing of the East Coast elites, West Coast, the coastal elites. In the subsequent administration, they drafted Bob Dole to be the vice president. Cheney and Rumsfeld pushed Rockefeller out, and the move towards the center states and towards what we now see is this, you know, polarized dynamic. You could say it really began there, and the whole question that you were talking about what does a country, what does a society owe to people, what does the government owe? It really, you know, those ideas of the Reagan era, these were intellectual ideas. Like, well, what exactly is government? And it was very much simplified in Reagan's, you know, presentation, which was like, there shouldn't be any.
Government is the problem.
It's the problem. There's too much of it. Such an easy thing to say. But to a place like New York City that had, you know, culturally, historically been a city with a government, and where the government was everywhere. It was a positive government. It was CUNY, like these were public hospitals. And also absorbing these waves of immigrants that, so as a service to the nation, burdened with all of these significant government roles. And
actually, your father had very kindly explained to me how this was not just a problem for New York City, but it would have been, if New York had gone bankrupt, it would have been a problem for the rest of the country, and it would have been a problem internationally. I don't think that that's a thought that even most New Yorkers would have had in those days. But why would this have been such almost a metastasizing problem if New York had gone bankrupt?
Well, I think it's not that different from the 2008 housing crisis. The idea that New York City would go bankrupt for basically arithmetic reasons. There was so much New York City debt that was in other banks' balance sheets that if New York had gone bankrupt, those banks were now in a very problematic financial position.
Right.
And those were national banks.
They could fail.
They could fail, and then the dollar fails, and the whole global economy that's pegged on the dollar then is shifting. And
there is a tremendous amount of uncharted territory if the leading city in the country would go bankrupt. It's to be avoided at all costs.
There were very strong signals from Germany and from France to Ford, eventually directly to him saying, what are you doing?
But that came later.
It did.
Ford,
First,
how do we get to this headline?
Right.
At the Daily News.
Right.
It finally gets beyond Bill Simon.
Right.
And Rumsfeld and Cheney or whatever.
Right.
And then Ford gave a speech. Can you talk about that?
Sure. He's at the National Press Club, and there is a desperate request for support from the city, from the government to the city. And Cheney and Rumsfeld, in this Midwestern sort of moralist mood, sent to David Gergen, your colleague,
right,
who was the chief speechwriter at the time for Ford
in the administration.
Right.
And they said, we want a really tough speech on this. And he wrote what he thought was a very tough speech, but he didn't think that they were going to just, he thought it would be watered down or they would staff it out or whatever. Lo and behold, Ford gave the speech. Gergen, who then became a famous counselor to presidents, you can't really imagine a worse PR disaster for a PR man, that this thing totally backfired. And what seemed like we're going to really teach them a lesson just galvanized New Yorkers together. And I think it also turned the tide nationally. It just didn't seem correct. And it arguably cost Ford the White House.
And just to put a point on it, sorry, but he gave the speech. Gergen wrote the speech, which again, he thought it would be watered down, as Michael said. Ford gave it. It went through Rumsfeld and Cheney. They did not water it down. If anything, they ratcheted it up. Ford gave it at the National Press Club. It was a hardcore speech that it talked about New York City was leaving its babies at the doorstep of the federal government, abandoned and unwanted. It wasn't by its true parents or whatever. It wasn't subtle. It was like, get out of here. Gave this really hard speech. The paper the next day put the headline, "Ford to City Drop Dead," which, just for the record, Ford never said drop dead. And Gergen
and he never stopped saying that he never actually said
to the day
drop
he died.
Dead.
Exactly.
But what he did, he said, no, we're not going to give you the help that you're asking for. Not only are we not going to give it to you, we're never going to give it to you because I'm opposed to this ideologically. This is not something that I believe in.
I am prepared to veto any bill that has as its purpose federal bailout of New York City to prevent a default.
We're up to here with being, and I hope to God that the damn city blows up.
The Daily News in those days was powerful. I mean, the enormous circulation, and really was read widely by working people and middle class people in New York City. So here's this big headline, and can you talk a little bit about the impact of that headline?
Well, I was just thinking as you were saying that, it almost strikes me almost as the 1975 version of going viral.
Yeah,
right?
Exactly.
It's essentially a meme if you think of it. It really resonated, as Michael said. It hit all kinds of people across New York City. It rallied essentially the city together against Ford. People were just, you're throwing us under the bus. And if you follow that forward, it had cascading effects where Ford ended up eventually losing, jumping forward, the presidential election
to Jimmy Carter.
And it arguably could have gone the other way, but it seemed to sway New York and galvanize them against Ford, even though ultimately things played out differently. But electorally, it had great consequences.
Right. So we haven't mentioned him yet, but Hugh Carey was the governor of New York at that time. Carey gets good marks on the way that he handled this crisis all the way through. Very difficult for him. And then this is how Felix Rohatyn comes into the picture. He recruits, if I have this correct, Felix to be the point person for guiding the city through the enormous problem that it's facing. And the state creates this agency called the Municipal Assistance Corporation, which is immediately dubbed Big Mac. So talk a little bit about Felix and about Big Mac and why Felix was the right person for that role. And what was the point of Big Mac?
Well, I think this story has a lot of extraordinary, just amazing people. And Hugh Carey is definitely one of them. He had been in the Congress for years and years. He was a product of the Brooklyn Democratic machine. He arrived, and within weeks he was looking at bankruptcies at state agencies that were vast and unprecedented since the Depression. So he came into an emergency situation. And I think there were not many bankers who were Democrats who the Democratic governor of New York could have turned to.
Right.
They wanted some, I guess, credibility with the banks. And they drafted my father. And he was somebody who had been very good at restructuring financially, companies that had been in difficulties. He was familiar with some of the structural stuff, totally unfamiliar with the personal stuff. But, now interacting with labor, with press, with government, these were all different dynamics that I think it was just he just turned out to be very good at it and really thrived on it, enjoyed gaining the trust of everybody. I think he loved the press, he loved you, he loved talking to reporters, being able to try to frame a story in a way that's going to work for you, be able to then talk to Victor Gottbaum.
Right.
Victor Gottbaum was the head of the Municipal Labor Union, which was, the biggest union in the city, hundreds of thousands of membership.
I mean, he had to deal with so many radically different types of people. If you're talking about Victor Gottbaum or if you're talking about the bankers, but then there's the politicians. But politicians upstate and downstate. Totally. That's completely. It was just, and not to mention the ordinary people of New York.
Right.
To me, that honestly, that's the lesson. What we did not make, I think, is a hagiography. This is not a film.
No, you did not.
The virtues of Michael's father, even though to me, growing up, I always had deep admiration for him. But the takeaway to me is, I think, the work that he did, and even Hugh Carey and others who are involved in this, is they built bridges between seemingly irreconcilable viewpoints and parties. And given the state of our country these days, I think if there was a single takeaway that I would hope people had from the film, it would be that. It's that people who had a belief in the importance of government, but also it needed to be reformed. They didn't just throw in the towel. They got in the room with people who had very, very different life experiences and very, very different political beliefs and economic beliefs and social status and all these things. And they got together and they threw things at each other, but they came out of the room and they figured it out. It is a model of real public servants in a true way, whether Michael's father, Hugh Carey, or lots of the labor leaders who would get together with bankers, labor leaders, et cetera, and figure it out and come to compromise.
We've only got a few seconds left. The federal government finally came around and did offer some guarantees. The city got through the crisis, but I want to close with just this point that Felix said that the cost of carrying out this agreement and avoiding bankruptcy, the inevitable cost of it, would mean that New York City would become a lesser place.
Right.
What did he mean by that?
Well, my father was really devoted to this city, and he was an FDR Democrat, and he really believed in the role of government in society. And New York is such a beautiful representation of that. It's a mess, it's complicated, we have somebody in our film saying it's got everything that's good with society and everything that's bad. I think I have that backwards.
No, it does.
Depends on your preference.
It has the best of
It is
society
the worst
and the
and the
worst.
best. But in any case, I think that the idea that New York could not be who it was because it was going to have to completely scale back on its ambition as being the city on the hill, as being a place where, we could provide for people across a credible range, meaning provide a wage, like a livable wage, an education, care, culture, all of those things. I think he would have. I think he thought the idea that there was no option.
We're going to have to leave it there. I wish we could talk more. I've been speaking with Michael Rohatyn and Peter Yost. They're the co-directors of a wonderful new film. It's called Drop Dead City, New York on the Brink in 1975. It's about the fiscal crisis. Thank you for watching. I'm Bob Herbert, and we'll see you next time.